In this video, we are talking about the sexual reproduction. The process of sexual reproduction involves two parents, one male and one female parent. And also there is process of formation of gametes over here. Now let us try and understand what is actually sexual reproduction. Now the sexual reproduction, in this method, it is a process of combining DNA from two different individuals during reproduction. What do we mean by that? That during the reproduction process, the male and the female both form the gametes, and these gametes have to be necessarily haploid. A good question can be why they need to be haploid. The reason is each species has fixed number of chromosomes and it has to be maintained for successive generations. Now if we are combining one male and one female, then if the male is contributing, let's say, let us take the example of human beings. Human beings have 46 chromosomes. Now, if these chromosomes are transferred as such, as in the form of a gamete, and the female also contributes 46 chromosomes again in a gamete, this will result into 92 chromosome in the offspring, and subsequently it will again combine. So soon it will have DNA all over, but we know that the number of chromosomes need to be maintained. So the organisms have evolved, or they have devised a method in which the cells undergo this. There are special cells called as the sex cells that undergo the process of meiosis, that is the reduction division, to form haploid gamete. And this haploid gametes, when they combine, they form into zygote. Now what is happening actually, if we try and understand in terms of number, 46 is the chromosome number of the male and 46 is the chromosome number of female. During the process of gamete formation, due to meiosis, meiotic division, the gamete formed will be 23 and 23 by female. When these two combine during the process of fertilization, 46 number is restored. So here we have 46 again. So this is how we maintain the continuity of a species. Now you have to understand that during the process of this meiotic division, the DNA copy is being made, and we know that during the DNA copy is being made, it is not 100% accurate. There are some variations. So the variations will be passed on to this gamete, and they will be also passed on to this gamete. When these two combine, they will have a variant type, although the basic body design remains the same. Now out of the two germ cells, we say male gametes, male or female gametes, or the germ cells. Out of the two germ cells we are talking of, one of the gamete is, or one of the germ cell is motile. That means it is capable of moving, and normally the male germ cell, or we call it as male gamete, it is motile. That means it is capable of moving, whereas the female germ cell or the female gamete is non-motile. It does not move, and it is slightly larger in size. It is smaller in size. The male gamete is motile and smaller in size, whereas the female gamete is non-motile and large in size. Also, the female gamete stores food to feed the developing zygote if fertilization happens. So these two types of gametes, when they fuse together, that is what is known as sexual reproduction. And you can now very well justify that why do sexual reproduction involves more variation. It is because each of the gamete will be subsequently bringing certain amount of variation, which when combined will further give rise to a slightly variant offspring. Now let us talk about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. When we talk of flowering plants, the flowering plants are all angiosperms. All the flowering plants belong to angiosperms. And when we talk of the function of the flower, besides having appealing approach or besides being attractive, the flower performs an important function, that is to bring about reproduction in the case of flowers. Now, when we talk of flowers, the flowers can be two types, that is unisexual or bisexual flowers. Unisexual flowers are those flowers that have either male or they are female, right? So the unisexual flowers are those flowers which either are male, only having the male reproductive parts, or maybe having only the female reproductive parts. Whereas the bisexual flowers, that is the first type, and when we talk of the second type, that is bisexual flowers, the bisexual flowers are those flowers which have male reproductive parts plus female reproductive parts. So it is having both male and female. Example of unisexual are watermelon, papaya, etc. And the bisexual ones are hibiscus is a very good example of the bisexual type of flowers. Now, coming to the structure, when we talk of the structure, now since the male and the female, most of the organisms that show sexual reproduction also show dimorphism. Dimorphism means the male and the female can be easily differentiated because they are structurally different. For example, human beings. So they show sexual dimorphism. Most of the organisms that show sexual reproduction are sexually dimorphic in structure. Now, when we talk of the parts of a flower, let's talk about various parts of the flower and then try to understand how does the sexual reproduction is brought about in them. As I told, this reproduction process, sexual reproduction, happens in all the flowering plants, though that is angiosperms. Let us have a longitudinal section of the flower, that means we have cut it this way, and try and understand the structure. This is the swollen portion and the ovary over here. The green leaves over there are known as sepals, and the brightly colored ones are the petals. Within this structure, you can see the ovary, and ovary is leading to a structure on the top which is known as stigma. And this tube-like structure which is leading from the ovary to the stigma, that is the ovary. Ovary contains the ovules, then the style is there, and the stigma. So this portion, stigma and ovary, are connected with the help of a structure which is known as style, and it is through this style that the pollen tube will pass. This stigma, style, ovary are together known as the female reproductive part, or we also call them as carpel. It is the swollen part will be the ovary, and the stigma over here, it is a red velvety structure in this case of a flower, and it is slightly sticky the main function of the stigma is to catch hold of the pollen grains. When they land onto the stigma, they are held with the help of this sticky substance. Ovary contains the ovules. So the ovules are present within this ovary, which are shown as black dots over here, and each of the ovule has an egg cell. When we study the structure, I'll be explaining, when we see the structure of the ovary, if we see, it is having 3 cells over here, 2 cells over here, and again 3 cells over here. Now, it contains, this black one is the egg cell actually. So, this is the diagram or the structure of the ovule. So, this is entire is known as the embryo sac, we call it. So, this embryo sac has the egg cell, that is the female gamete, and the fusion of the germ cells. These germ cells will fuse, and therefore the fertilization will be brought about. If we see to this diagram over here, it is somewhat like this. Now, coming to the male reproductive part, that is the stamen. Stamen is the male reproductive part, and it is known as, it is consisting of anther and the filament. Over here you can see that these dotted blue ones are the anthers, and this tube-like structure which is present is known as the filament. Inside the anther are the pollen grains. So pollen grains are present within the anthers. Now, how is fertilization brought about? Fertilization is a complex process. Now, what happens is, due to the landing of the pollen grain on the stigma is brought about by several agents. They can be, if it is a unisexual flower, the pollination needs to be done, that is the transfer of the pollen grain should be there from the male reproductive part to the stigma of the other flower. Then only the fertilization will be brought about in the case of unisexual flowers. In the case of bisexual flowers, since both male and female reproductive parts are in one flower, the pollination can be self-pollination. That means the pollen will fall from the to the stigma of the same flower. So self-pollination or cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is the term when the pollination happens from one flower to the other flower of the same species, and it has to be brought about with the help of certain agents called as wind, it can be water, or it can be animals. And self-pollination happens when the transfer of the pollen takes place within the same flower. That is in the case of bisexual flowers. So, the pollination happens, and pollination, how do we define pollination? It is the transfer of the pollen to the stigma, and it is of 2 types. As discussed, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now, after the pollen lands onto the stigma, due to the sticky nature of the stigma, the pollen grain lands onto the stigma. After it lands onto here, there is certain chemical reaction which takes place, and the pollen tube develops. This pollen tube carry the male gamete within itself. So over here, as you can see this diagram, the pollen grains are there, and from the pollen grains, the male gamete is released, and it is carried by the pollen tube, which is shown as blue tube over here. It travels through the style. Now, as I told you, this is the style. This structure is the style. So, it travels through the style, reaches to the ovule. That is the ovary at the end. Now, after the fertilization happens, that is, the male gamete will travel all the way inside, and it will fuse with the egg cell which is present over here. After the fusion has happened, it will result into the formation of zygote. So after fertilization, in the case of sexual reproduction, a zygote is formed, and this zygote multiplies several times so as to form the embryo within the ovule. So what happens is, after the male gamete, this is the male gamete we are talking of, male gamete and the female gamete. These two fuse, that is due to fertilization, they will form the zygote. This zygote multiplies several times and forms the embryo. Now, the ovule, that is this structure, the ovule which is present, this ovule inside the ovary, ovule develops a tough protective coat and forms the seed. So ovule, as the multiplication is going on inside, the cell division is going on, ovule will form the seed and it will be a hard, tough protective coating. The ovary grows rapidly and it forms a fruit. And you know that ovules are present inside and the ovary is present outside. So the ovule will develop as seed, and this ovary develops into fruit. So this fruit is actually the edible part which you eat is the ovary that forms the nutritious material for the embryo to develop. Now, as soon as the this process is achieved, that is the fertilization is achieved, the flower parts, that is the sepals, the petals, the stamen style, wither off. That means they fall off because the main purpose of the flower has been achieved, and that was fertilization. The flowers you have seen, they are brightly and attractively colored. This attraction and these bright colors, they are full of nectars. So these properties of flowers attract insects, honeybees, and as a result the pollination is brought about. After the pollination, when the fertilization happens, the formation of the fruit and the seed is there, the parts, that is the petals, sepals and all, their purpose is achieved, and as a result they shrivel off and fall. So this seed formation enables the plant to withstand unfavorable condition, because the seed can be carried and also it can be carried far and wide. The seed can be easily carried from one place to the other. Also, it can withstand unfavorable conditions, because a seed will not germinate unless and until the favorable conditions are provided to it for germination. So, and the seed is amply, or it has sufficient amount of food so that it can withstand the different hard conditions. So this process, entire process in sexual reproduction of the flower, ends into the formation of the seed. When the seed is sown and it is provided with appropriate condition, it will start developing, or it will form a new plant. That process is known as germination, and it will happen only when the plant is provided with the conditions that are apt or suitable for the growth. Once the plant grows, then it again attains maturity, flowers, and again the reproduction process happens. So this cycle continues.